So it's my privilege to have a conversation with you about God's original purpose for work. Why do we work? If you want to interact with what I have to say, you can best do that by means of Twitter, and I think you'll see my Twitter handle. Just use the TogetherLA hashtag so that I know what's coming at me. To think about God's purpose for work, I think a good place to start is, well, at the beginning. Genesis 1 offers us a poem that works as a map. It creates a space for us poetically in those very first words of the Bible when it says, "In the beginning, God created." It shows us the context within which the entire remainder of the story of the Bible unfolds. It tells us where we find ourselves also when we want to think about the purpose of our work. It's a beautiful poem. It unfolds in a way where it gives us a picture of God making room, light and darkness, for specific creatures, sun, moon, and stars, the heavens and the waters, birds and the fish of the sea, dry land and plant life as a home for animals and humans. And in the poetry of those very first words of the Bible, it gives us a picture of the hospitality of God. And I think this notion of the hospitality of God is crucial, foundational for our understanding of the purpose of our own work. What's wonderful also as we read the poetry of those first lines of the Bible is that as it gives us a picture of God hospitably creating a space for God's creatures to dwell in, it pauses every few lines to tell us, and then God saw that it was good. So in addition to giving us a picture of God's hospitality, it gives us a picture of God's delight in the creatures that God has made. After it gives us this map and tells us where we find ourselves, it continues to tell us who we are. Genesis 1 and 2 tells us what it means to be human, and among other things, it tells us that human beings are made to image God. What it means to be human in the context of this place of God's hospitality is to show forth, to portray God to God's creatures. And so while there is so much to say about God's purpose for work, I want to keep it crisp and clean and clear and say this. God's purpose for our work is to share God's delight in and God's hospitality towards God's creatures. I want you to think for a moment what that looks like in the work that you do. What does it look like to work in such a way that in your work you are sharing God's delight in what God has created? What does it look like in your work to create hospitality for God's creatures? The creatures, human and otherwise, with which we share this place of God's hospitality. To give you an example that may not connect directly to many of our work, but that is relevant in Los Angeles, I want to talk briefly about painting, the work of painting. Not house painting, but painting fun art paintings, and looking particularly at two of my favorite painters, Helen Frankenthaler and Rembrandt van Rijn. One of my favorite paintings by, and it should show up, there's Helen Frankenthaler painting on the floor, and a self-portrait by Rembrandt, and then in the next slide, you'll see a green painting. It's called A Green Thought in a Green Shade. In 1981, Helen Frankenthaler painted this, and I think what this painting shows us is the delight of the painter in this aspect of God's creation, the sheer magic of color. When I looked at this painting, I thought of a line from a letter that the theologian John Calvin wrote in the 16th century, saying that there is no one blade of grass, there is no color in this world that is not intended to make us rejoice. I think we see in the work of this painter an example of someone like God delighting in something that is part of this great creation. In the little painting that's embedded in that, you see a portrait of a young businessman in his 30s by the name of Jan Six. Simon Sharma is a historian of that era of time, and he said that this is the greatest painting of the 17th century. And what it does is it shows us someone who's about to step into the street at his front door, and he's just pulling on his gloves. And Sharma says that we see in this painting, really for one of the first times in all of the history of painting, someone who has two faces on at the same time. We're seeing this young businessman with his mirror face on, the way he sees himself. And at the same time, we see him with his street face on, the way that he wants to be seen by other people as he steps out there. And it creates this double portrait of someone reflecting on himself as who he is and who he wants to be perceived as. As Rembrandt painted this painting, his first client, he painted it for this guy to put up in his own house. And the family has had it for the subsequent 10 generations. But what Rembrandt did was to create a space of hospitality immediately in front of the painting, where this young man could stand and be confronted with himself, a space of hospitality within which he could become, reflecting on himself, more who God had created him to be. And in all the subsequent generations, human beings have been able to look at that painting in a space of hospitality created by the painter, inviting us to reflect on what it means to be human beings in front of the mirror and out on the street. The delight that Frankenthaler takes in the color green, the hospitality with which Rembrandt creates a space in which we can reflect on our humanity, I think, shows us what it looks like to work in a way that is purposeful and a way that follows God's purpose for human work. What does that look like here in LA? To give you two examples of people who show God's delight and share God's hospitality through their everyday work. You'll see a picture of my car just after a tree fell on it. And so late in December, the wind blew a tree over onto my car, and I had to take it back to a guy by the name of Rant, H-R-A-N-T. He's an Armenian-American in Pasadena. He's one of my favorite business people that I've ever met. Unassuming guy, small auto shop. And for the past 4 years, this guy has, in a trustworthy way, reliably fixed my admittedly ugly car. And by means of that reliable service, auto service, has created a possibility for me to live in this city in the context of Los Angeles car culture, created hospitality for me in the city so that I could get, here today, so that I could travel around doing my work, meet up with people, take my kids to the beach. But in that way, Rand has shown God's purpose for human work by extending hospitality as a simple auto mechanic, third-generation guy, to someone like me. I can hike from my house for about 10 minutes into the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains. And there I can find Nuccio's nursery, where for 70 years the Nuccio family has been growing azaleas and camellias. And I have seldom met someone who can talk with such passion and delight about God's creation as the Nuccio brothers. Recently, in the beginning of January, I spent easily an hour and a half being taken through the shade-netted nursery, looking at a variety of camellias and listening to this man who could talk about the color and the fragrance of the flowers of different kinds of camellias, which camellias lived best in the shade and which lived best in the sun. His grandfather planted a camellia in the Pope's garden in the Vatican City. And to share in the delight of this man in the camellia plant life that's possible in Los Angeles was for me an image of what it was like when God looked at what he had created there at the beginning and said, "This is good." So consider for yourself in what ways you extend God's hospitality through the work that you do every day. create spaces in which God's creatures can realize their potential, human and otherwise, camellias, cars, people. And consider in what way you show forth God's delight in God's creation in what you do every way.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.